You know what used to frustrate me more than anything in the shop? I would spend 20 minutes setting up my hand plane, take a pass across a board, and get tear out right in the middle of a piece I had been working on all afternoon. Didn't matter how sharp the blade was, didn't matter how carefully I adjusted the depth. I kept fighting the wood, and the wood kept winning. Then about 5 years ago I came across a video of a Japanese carpenter using a hand plane, and I had to stop what I was doing and just watch. He was pulling the plane toward him, not pushing it, and the shaving coming off that board was so thin you could see light through it. The surface underneath looked like it had been polished, no sandpaper anywhere in sight. That was the moment I realized I had been thinking about hand planes completely wrong. Today I am going to walk you through the Japanese approach to hand planing, what they do differently, why it works so much better than what most of us were taught, and how you can start applying these methods in your own shop. Plus, stick around to the end, because I will show you a sharpening technique I picked up that gave me the cleanest edge I have ever put on a blade. Let me start with a little context. The Japanese hand plane, called a kana, has been the primary smoothing tool in Japanese woodworking for centuries. And I do not mean centuries as an exaggeration. There are temple structures in Japan that are over 1,000 years old, where you can still see the original planed surfaces on the interior timbers. That wood was finished with nothing but a blade and a wooden body, and it still looks beautiful. The reason this tradition developed the way it did comes down to practical necessity. Japan has always had access to extraordinary softwoods, especially Hinoki cypress, which is their most prized building timber. Hinoki has a tight, straight grain and a natural fragrance, but it is also soft enough that aggressive sanding would destroy the surface fibers. So Japanese craftsmen developed a planing technique that cuts the wood cleanly at the cellular level instead of abrading it. There is a philosophy behind this that took me a while to really understand. In Japanese woodworking, the goal is not to remove material until the surface is flat. The goal is to reveal the wood. That sounds like poetry, but it is actually the most practical advice I have ever received about using a hand plane. When you plane a board with the Japanese method, you are slicing the wood fibers so cleanly that the grain pattern becomes more vivid, the surface reflects light differently, and the wood actually resists moisture better because the cells are sealed shut instead of torn open. Once I understood that, everything else started to make sense. The first thing that separates the Japanese approach from what most of us learned is the direction of the cut. Western hand planes are push planes. You stand behind the board and drive the plane away from your body. The Japanese kana is a pull plane. You stand at the end of the board and draw the plane toward you. When I first tried this, it felt completely unnatural. I had been pushing planes for 30 years. But within about 10 minutes, I started to feel why it works. When you pull a plane, your arms and shoulders are in a much more natural position. You are engaging your core and your legs, not just your arms. The result is that you have far more control over downward pressure, and you can feel what the blade is doing in real time. With a push plane, by the time you feel resistance or hear a change in the cut, the tear out has already happened. With a pull plane, you feel it coming, and you can adjust before the damage is done. I tested this side by side on a piece of curly maple, which is about the worst wood you can try to plane. With my number 4 Bailey pushing forward, I got tear out on almost every pass. With the kana pulling toward me, I was able to take a shaving so fine that the curl was translucent, and the surface underneath was clean. Same wood, same grain direction, completely different result. The second method that changed my thinking is how the Japanese set up the plane body itself. A Western metal plane has a machined sole and an adjustable frog, and most of us spend our time fiddling with the lateral adjustment lever and the depth wheel. The kana has a wooden body called a die, and there are no mechanical adjustments at all. You set the blade depth by tapping it with a small hammer. You retract it by tapping the back of the die. That sounds primitive until you realize it gives you sensitivity that no adjustment wheel can match. A single light tap moves the blade by a fraction of a thousandth of an inch. Try getting that kind of precision from a brass knob. But here is the part that really surprised me. The sole of the DIE is not flat. Japanese woodworkers deliberately hollow out the sole so that only 3 points make contact with the wood: the toe, the area just in front of the blade mouth, and a small section at the heel. The rest of the sole is relieved by just a few thousandths of an inch. This reduces friction dramatically, which means the plane glides with less effort, and the only pressure points are exactly where they need to be to support the cut. When I first learned this, I thought it was a flaw. I had spent years flattening the soles of my Western planes on sandpaper and granite. The idea of intentionally making the sole not flat went against everything I believed. But once I tried it, the difference in how the plane moved across the wood was immediate. It was like the plane was floating. By the way, if you are enjoying learning about these ancient methods, I put together something I think you will really appreciate. It is called Kenji's Workshop, and it is a collection of 100 Ancient Eastern Woodworking Secrets for the Modern Craftsman, techniques like the ones we are covering today, and a whole lot more. You can grab your copy by scanning the QR code on screen, or just use the first link in the description. All right, let us keep going. The third method is about reading the grain before you ever touch the plane to the wood. Most of us were taught to plane in one direction, and if we get tear out, flip the board around and go the other way. That is a reactive approach. The Japanese method is proactive. Before making a single pass, a Japanese craftsman examines the edge of the board and the face to determine the grain direction. They look at how the fibers rise toward the surface, almost like the grain is a series of tiny shingles overlapping each other. You want to plane in the direction that goes with those shingles, not against them. The way I learned to check this is simple. Run your hand along the face of the board in both directions. One direction will feel slightly smoother than the other. The smooth direction is the direction you want to plane. You are going with the grain, letting the blade slide under the fibers instead of lifting them up. Japanese woodworkers take this even further. They will examine a board for several minutes before starting, identifying areas where the grain shifts direction, knots that will cause problems, and sections where the annular rings suggest the wood will behave differently. They plan their planing strategy before they make a single cut. I started doing this about 3 years ago, and my tear out dropped by at least 70% overnight. The fourth method is about sharpening, and this is where the Japanese approach really sets itself apart. Most Western woodworkers sharpen their plane blades to somewhere between 4,000 and 8,000 grit equivalent. That gives you a sharp edge that will produce a decent surface. Japanese woodworkers sharpen to a level that most of us have never even attempted. They use natural water stones, some of which are mined from specific quarries that have been producing sharpening stones for hundreds of years. The finishing stones can be the equivalent of 15,000 to 30,000 grit. At that level of polish, the edge is so refined that it does not just cut wood fibers, it severs them at the cellular level. The difference in surface quality is visible to the naked eye. A board planed with an 8,000 grit edge looks smooth. A board planed with a natural Japanese finishing stone looks like it has been coated with a thin layer of lacquer. The fibers are so cleanly cut that they reflect light uniformly. I invested in a set of Japanese water stones about 4 years ago. A good quality finishing stone will run you anywhere from $60 to $200 depending on the grade. It was one of the best purchases I have ever made for my shop. The sharpening process takes a little longer, maybe an extra 5 to 10 minutes per session, but the results are in a completely different category. The fifth method is about taking the lightest possible shaving. In Western planing, we often set the blade for a moderate cut, maybe 3 or 4 thousandths of an inch, to remove material efficiently. The Japanese finishing technique calls for shavings that are measured in fractions of a thousandth of an inch. I am talking about shavings so thin that they are genuinely translucent. In Japan, there are actually competitions called kezurukai, where craftsmen compete to produce the thinnest continuous shaving. The winners often produce shavings measured at between 3 and 9 microns thick. To put that in perspective, a human hair is about 70 microns. These shavings are 10 times thinner than a hair. Now, you do not need to hit competition-level thinness in your shop, but the principle matters. When you take an extremely light cut with an extremely sharp blade, the surface that remains is essentially burnished by the act of cutting. There is no torn fiber, no raised grain, no fuzz. The wood looks and feels like it has been finished, even though nothing has been applied to it. I aim for shavings that I can see light through. That is my benchmark. If the shaving is opaque, I know I am taking too much. Let me share some patterns I have noticed over the years, things I used to do myself, that this tradition handles completely differently. The first pattern is reaching for sandpaper as the default finishing method. Most of us sand because it is what we were taught, and it does produce a smooth surface to the touch. But sanding tears wood fibers and leaves a surface that is microscopically fuzzy. When you apply a finish to a sanded surface, the finish sits on top of that fuzz. When you apply a finish to a properly planned surface, it penetrates cleanly and evenly. The difference in the final appearance is striking. The second pattern is fighting tear out instead of preventing it. I spent years adjusting my chip breaker, closing my mouth opening, and changing my cutting angle to deal with tear out after it happened. The Japanese approach of reading the grain and planning your planing direction before you start eliminates most tear out before it ever occurs. The third pattern is relying on mechanical adjustments instead of developing feel. Those brass knobs and lateral levers on a Western plane are helpful, but they can also become a crutch. When you learn to set a blade by tap and feel, you develop a sensitivity to the tool that no mechanism can replace. You start to understand what the plane is telling you through your hands. The good news is, once you see these patterns for what they are, you can start shifting your approach one project at a time. You do not have to throw out your Western planes or rebuild your entire sharpening station overnight. Now for that bonus tip I promised at the beginning. This one is about how Japanese craftsmen condition their blades right after sharpening. Once the edge is honed to their finishing grit, they do something most of us would never think to do. They strop the back of the blade, the flat face, on the finishing stone with just the weight of the blade itself. No pressure at all, just the weight of the steel resting on the stone, drawn back 3 or 4 times. What this does is remove the microscopic wire edge that forms during sharpening. Most of us try to remove the wire edge by alternating sides with pressure, which can actually round over the edge slightly. By using zero pressure on the back, you cleanly break off that wire edge without affecting the geometry of the cutting edge at all. When I started doing this, I noticed my blades stayed sharper longer, and the first shaving off a freshly sharpened blade was just as clean as the 10th. It is a 30-second step that made a genuine difference in my results. Before we wrap up, if today's video taught you something new, imagine having 100 techniques like this at your fingertips. That is exactly what Kenji's workshop is. It is my collection of Ancient Eastern Woodworking Secrets for the Modern Craftsman, all in one place, with detailed photos and clear instructions. You can get your copy by scanning the QR code on screen or using the link in the description. Thanks for being here. I will see you next time.